Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. I'm coming to you from unceded territory of the Musqueam and Squamish Nations near Vancouver, Canada. I was on this side of the Pacific Ocean when the pandemic started and the planes stopped flying. So I'm doing my work these days from Canada, but still very much ingrained in the campaigns and struggles in Australia. And I am, of course, a paid up member of the ASU. This is my union too, and I'm very proud that our Center for Future Work, where we do progressive research on labor issues, has 100% ASU density. So how about that? All three of us are members of the union, and we're very proud to be joining you in this fight to save what was really a historic victory on pay equity. So I'm going to share a few slides to guide my way through the presentation here. And hopefully this is working. Angus, give me the thumbs up if you see the slide title. Okay, excellent. Defending pay equity. What's at stake with the coming federal budget decision? So here is our website, and the full report that I'm speaking from is there on the website. It's the landing page today. So I invite you to go and check that out. And there's my Twitter handle and our center's Twitter handle. You're welcome to join the conversation on social media, including you're welcome to tweet from this presentation if you'd like. And in addition to the report itself, we did have some great media coverage of the report today. This was a story that was in the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, a few other newspapers about both the economic impact and the human impact if the Commonwealth government gets away with cutting the funding that has been in place for the last 8 years to support the implementation of pay equity. So I invite you to check that out as well. Now, Emmeline and Michelle have both run over a little bit of the history of what we're talking about here. This equal remuneration order from the Fair Work Commission in 2012, what a path-setting decision that was, and what a victory for the ASU and everyone else who campaigned for it. And in the 8 years since then, we've seen the phase-in of that pay equity award. 9 different steps were required to get to pay equity. It's not like pay equity started 9 years ago. It's like we started taking the first steps toward it 9 years ago. And as of December 1st this year, the final stage of that phase-in will be completed. So as of December 1st, we can celebrate and say, finally, pay equity has got here. We celebrated the victory 8 years ago that it was going to come, and now it has arrived. Now, at the time that the initial decision was made, it was estimated that the decision would apply to a little bit over 150,000 workers in Australia, and that's a large number of people, really, whose jobs would be transformed by this decision. But guess what? The number is a lot bigger now, because the reality is community services and all the different particular programs and services that are offered through this whole sector have grown dramatically over the last decade because the needs have grown dramatically. So we did some research as part of this report. We would estimate now that this order, the pay equity order, will now apply to roughly about 230,000 workers in all kinds of different particular service organizations in all parts of Australia. And this decision, as was noted earlier, led to special wage increases, depending on where you were in the pay grid, of between 23 and 45%. And that was on top of the normal annual wage increases that were received each year as well. On July 1st of each year, typically we all get a regular pay increase because of the minimum wage decision and the awards as they flows through to people covered by awards. So if you combine the two, you're getting one wage increase in July, another one in December. Over that period, wages in this sector grew by between 60 and 100%. So it really has transformed the nature of these jobs, and in many cases lifted the people doing these services out of poverty and able to have a living wage and support their family at a decent standard. So this is what's at stake if we don't defend this history. Now, the money to pay for pay equity didn't fall from the sky. Okay, this is not just a sort of symbolic declaration, let's be equal. It has to have a real economic basis. And that, of course, was a big part of the fight. And the ASU recognized that from the beginning in terms of not just demanding pay equity as a principle, but demanding the real commitment of resources to allow that to actually happen. So just as important as the Fair Work Commission decision was winning the commitment from the state governments and the Commonwealth government at the time to provide additional resources to the community service organizations so that they could actually pay this, because the scale of wage increases involved was very substantial. And community services in general depend directly and heavily on the workers. It's a very labor intensive undertaking to provide these services, because there's a lot of people doing face-to-face contact with people who use those services. So this was crucial from the beginning. And at the Commonwealth level, the government at the time committed to a special account. It was called the Social and Community Services Pay Equity Special Account. And they literally set aside $2.8 billion, a lot of money over 8 years, to phase in the pay equity award, so that with each step of the award, the federally supported community service organizations received a larger amount each year. And the last installment of this is being paid in the current financial year. The 2020-21 financial year, the federal government will provide $576.5 million to community services across the country to help in the last step of that phased-in pay equity award. The question is, what happens now? Pay equity has arrived. The program of wage increases is complete as of December the 1st. The state governments have recognized that they have to maintain the funding, but the Commonwealth government is absolutely needlessly and inexplicably dragging its feet on this. And the result is you've got hundreds of community organizations across the country wondering what the heck is going to happen after the current financial year is over. Is the federal government going to step up and maintain this funding, or are they just going to say, well, that was then, this is a new reality, and leave every organization up to its own devices? There's two options, really, two different ways that the federal government could be maintaining the support. I think the most obvious and logical would be to say, look, we have taken 8 years and 9 stages to phase in pay equity. It's now the new normal. Let's just adjust the baseline funding formulas for these organizations so that they can do what they need to do and pay the accepted pay equity wages at the same time. That would be the logical step moving forward. An alternative would be to say, okay, we have this supplemental funding in a kind of separate envelope, and we'll carry that on the side. I think option one is more sensible, it's more logical, and it also means that the funding is kind of in the core of the system rather than an add-on, and that would stabilize it for the future. But one way or another, the federal government's got to provide these funding. If they don't, then the consequences are going to be enormous. Now, the state governments, as I mentioned, have committed in almost every case explicitly to carrying on the funding, generally by folding it into a new baseline level of support for these organizations. Anyone who's doing disability services that's covered by the NDIS is also covered, because the NDIS is now funded on a totally separate way than these community organizations. There's a unit price schedule that's defined for all the different tasks that are delivered through the NDIS. And the funding formula has been explicitly adjusted to include the equal remuneration order. So they're covered. By our research, we estimate there's about 57,000 other workers in organizations that depend partly or fully on federal funding. And those are the jobs and services that are really at risk if the federal government doesn't come through. Now, I mentioned they gave $576 million this year as the last installment on the special account. That needs to grow each year for various reasons. Number one, the base level of wages increases each year. We're getting a 1.75% increase in the wage schedule this year. Secondly, the overall workforce is growing as well. So for both reasons, it has to be an even larger amount next year, in the order of $600 million. And by our estimates, that represents about 21% of the wage bill, the total wage bill for community service organizations that are partly or fully funded by the federal government. What happens if you just snap that money away? Well, you don't need the PhD in economics to understand that it's going to be a disaster. And this is kind of like a game show. You got three doors you can go through here. Door number one, door number two, door number three. What is an organization going to do if funding corresponding to 21% of their wage bill suddenly disappears? Option number one, they're going to have to cut staffing and services. They just don't have enough money to keep everyone on doing what they were doing before. So that will hurt the staff and it will hurt the clients who use those services. Door number two, they could try to claw back the funding from wages. Now, the base level of wages, of course, is specified in the award, so you can't just directly cut someone's pay, keeping them in the same job. But we all know that employers have all kinds of different ways that they can cut effective wages, including reclassifying people or getting rid of the existing staff and bringing in new staff on a different lower pay grade, et cetera, et cetera. Or door number three is you could have a little bit of both. So we modeled what would happen if they went through door number one and used staff cuts to save the full effect of the $600 million lost funding. You're looking at the loss of 12,000 positions in community services, vital community services across the country. If you went through door number two and tried to take it all out of wages, well, then you're going to have to, on average, for a full-time person in this sector, cut the wages by about $15,000 a year, or the equivalent of about $7.50 an hour for part-time workers. What a devastating rollback that is for people who finally have just got to the pay equity level after 8 long years of phasing it in. Or it could be both, a combination of reduced staffing and lower wages. Either way, it's a disaster. It's a disaster for the workers involved. It's a disaster for the organizations who try to do so much already with so little. And it's a disaster for the economy, frankly. I mean, just look out there. We're dealing with the worst economic recession in 80 years since the 1930s. We're dealing with a public health emergency, and then all of the human and health and social consequences of that emergency, including the stresses that it's imposing on families and communities as people try to get through this catastrophe. We're facing a catastrophe. And the idea that the Commonwealth government, which has unlimited financing at its disposal, which has shown it is willing and capable to snap its fingers and raise tens of billions or even hundreds of billions of dollars to meet its priorities, including wage subsidies to employers and other programs. Why on earth would they be stalling and putting these services, these workers, and these communities in jeopardy? We have a situation where for the first time in Australia's history, there's more than 1 million people officially unemployed. And that, frankly, is just the tip of the iceberg, because there's hundreds of thousands others who aren't working but don't show up in the official unemployment statistics for various technical reasons and different loopholes. And there's more job losses coming, particularly because the federal government is rolling back some of the emergency income supports and wage subsidies that they had been paying. So frankly, it's going to get worse before it gets better. I hate to be the bearer of bad news in that regard, but this is inconceivable that the government, on top of all that, would say, well, we're dragging our feet on something that already exists. Why make things worse by either cutting 12,000 jobs or cutting wages by an equivalent amount and undermining consumer spending in Australia by another $600 million? I also want to talk about in a way, the moral outrage of threatening this progress towards equality that the Pay Equity Award and its implementation represented. We know that there's a terrible problem of gender inequality in Australia, including along with other dimensions of inequality in our society, of course. We know that progress towards fixing that problem has been painfully slow, but this particular case is an inspiration, and it's a bright light in an otherwise concerning outlook for gender pay equality. The reality is that this equal remuneration award, as it's been phased in, made a measurable difference in closing the gender wage gap in Australia. You can see it in the data. Here's how. We broke down the data on the gender wage gap across all the major industries in Australia. And not coincidentally, it's in the broad health and social service sector that includes these community service organizations that the gender pay gap shrank the most over the last decade. It shrank by 10 percentage points. That's over 3 times as much as the overall gender pay gap declined in the same period, more than any other sector. So that's the good news. The bad news, the health and social services sector still has the largest gender pay gap of any industry in Australia. because of the fact that women, by and large, are channeled into the lower paying occupations within the industry. So this is no time to roll back what was a historic victory. In fact, the fight for gender equity has to carry on. And there's absolutely no reason, no economic reason, no moral reason for the federal government to be jeopardizing this progress with its inexplicable stalling. So just to wrap up, as everyone knows, the fight for pay equity in this sector was an incredible victory, a path-setting victory, a precedent that inspires people in all parts of the economy to try to win gender pay equity. And it was the ASU, of course, that led that fight. And as an ASU member like you, I'm incredibly proud of what this legacy means. And it didn't come from the sky. Neither the victory itself nor the money to pay for it came from the sky. It happened because working people, working women, and their allies, working men, fought for and won this absolutely vital principle, and fought for and won the economic resources to make it a reality. And so it's frustrating, but in a way, it's not surprising that we have to maintain that fight and continue to build and mobilize our power if we want to keep that victory alive. So thank you to the ASU and all its members for what you're doing, and we're really glad to be part of the fight. Emily and I look forward to our discussion, and I'm going to send around on the chat the link to the paper so that everyone can download it directly as well. Thank you very much.